Hey guys, and welcome to my podcast for apologetics. So what you're about to get into here, just really quick before we really get into this, is that from here on out and through the future, that we are going to be just digging into different topics for apologetics. Now, this episode simply is just what is apologetics. What you're going to get is you're going to get what is apologetics, where it came from, different approaches to apologetics, and three men. And I know there's like 2,000 years worth of church history here, but I only picked three men who I think who are highly important in the history of the church in terms of defending the faith. We're going to just kind of give a little gloss over on those guys and how they defended the faith and just kind of what they went through and all those different kind of things. Now, let's just get this out the way first, because you may be thinking to yourself like, "Oh, apologetics means apologize. It means to, it just means to say I'm sorry," and it doesn't. I'm sorry, but it doesn't. It doesn't mean to apologize. It means to give a defense. But when we're talking specifically in terms of Christianity, that it means to defend the Christian faith and doctrine and teachings and practices. Now, apologetics can get very complex because there can be a bunch of different scopes and purposes and differences in uses for apologetics. Now, apologetics finds its root in the word apologia. It's a Greek word, and it means to simply give a defense. I mean, in the times of ancient Greece, it was a natural and a regular, normal judicial procedure that when someone had just made an accusation, that the defendant could then stand up and then give their apologia, which means to give a defense. The most famous is that of Socrates. I mean, he was accused of preaching strange gods. I mean, they didn't. He didn't really believe in like everybody else did, so he was accused for it. Um, and he stood up and gave his defense or his apologia. Now, this was recorded by his most famous pupil, who was Plato, and he records this in his apology or his apologia. Now, in terms of the New Testament, this is used like 17 different times. The most famous you probably know is 1 Peter 3:15 to always be ready to give a defense, and it's also seen in Philippians 1:7, and also it's seen in verse 16 of that same passage in Philippians 1. Now, in when you get to the second and third centuries of the church, things get a little bit different because the term apologetics takes on a almost a whole new meaning. Basically, as the Christian church and its practices and doctrines and teachings were continuing to be under attack from different faiths and different people groups and all these kind of different things, and different accusations from all around everywhere, basically. Um, they basically had to stand up and start defending themselves and start defending what they believed and defining and being precise about it. I mean, even like the smallest little like change of a word could really define something better than it did before, and they can change a whole meaning to a doctrine. So really, um, and these guys they were called apologists, and if you even look at the names of their works, take Justin Martyr for example, who we're going to look at here in a little bit. Justin, he named his two works specifically. They're called the apologies, the first apology and the second apology, addressed to two different people. So that's how it looks for in terms of the New Testament. But there's three different ways I found that apologetics could be used. I know there's presuppositional, there's historical, there's classical. I'm not going to really get into which one I love the most or which one I ascribe to the most. But what I will say is that, to be honest with you, they're all great. They're all useful for different moments, for different situations. Um, and that's all I'm really going to say about that, because people can get kind of heated on which one's better, which one's not, and as you know, if you're in this camp of theology, you need to be using this kind of apologetics, and if you're in this camp, you need to use this kind of apologetics. But to be honest with you, I don't think it quite matters. Like, it's so secondary, to be honest with you. So just use the one that is best suited for the situation that you're in. But this first one is going to be the vindication of proof. That the vindication of proof pretty much is just a modge podge, or a just gathering together of things like philosophy, his history, and science, and pretty much using those things to say, hey, look, the faith as a whole, genuinely is to be accepted because it's rational. Now, the historical part, because most people, you may think that Christianity may have no kind of backing historical ever, but the problem is that there's more than absolutely anybody else, like more than everyone. Like genuinely, Christianity, like we know from guys like Pliny, guys like Tacitus, from the Babylonian Talmud, Jesus existed. He did miracles. He had disciples. He was put to death, and they even kind of admit the resurrection. We're going to talk about that in a later episode, just not today. But they do admit the resurrection, and even from the historical standpoint of apologetics, like we can see that we have far more manuscript support than any other ancient work. Like we put all other works, including Homer, to shame. Like Homer, like I mean, yes, like he wrote the Iliad, and yes, it was like the Bible to the Greeks, and but we only have fewer than like 650 of these today, and they're written. They date back as far as the second and third century. Considering that Romer wrote this epic in like the 800s BC, it's quite a lengthy gap. But for in terms of the New Testament, we have like over like 5,000 manuscripts cataloged. So and it puts Josephus his work on the Jewish war to shame. So we have things like that historically that really show us that Christianity historically can be trusted. Scientifically, most people think that science and faith are just at odds, like they're just fighting all the time, like two rams just butting together. But actually, in reality, faith and science are like best friends. Genuinely, like science can show us that God exists, and that the universe had a beginning, therefore it must have had a cause. And also, it shows us that medically, that Jesus, there's no way that he couldn't have not died on the cross. Because I know like people like Muslims will tell you that, Jesus didn't die on the cross, he was taken up. Well, that's impossible because he actually died on the cross. Medically, we know that. And then you have philosophical. Now, most people think that when you become a Christian that you just turn your back on, you just shun faith, you just shun logic, you shun reason. But in reality, philosophy, that side of it, really tells us that one, that truth exists, that objective truths exist. Not only that, but it tells us that the laws of logic exist, which most atheists, they really can't tell you that it does, because from their worldview, it just doesn't exist. And they can't explain it either. And also, it tells us that because the universe had a beginning, then therefore it has a cause, which means it must be God. Now, that it doesn't quite get you to the Christian God, to the Trinity, but it does show you that there is a God. And then by using the historical part of it, then it really goes to show that the God that exists, that can only be one infinite being, must be the triune God in the Bible, the triune God of the Scriptures. That'll be a whole nother episode for that as well. I'll get to that eventually, but so that's the vindication of proof. Pretty much all these things as a whole show us that Christianity is logical and it is to be accepted. Now, the next one really has to do with defense. Now, this is probably the closest that we get to the New Testament understanding of apologia, the New Testament understanding of giving a defense. And really, it has to do with defending your faith against various attacks and beliefs. And this has happened throughout the history of the church. But to be quite genuine with you, it really has to do also on part of the Christian defining our terms and just being more clear about what we say that we believe. So really, I think the best example of this is when you go and you look at Jude, his epistle, even though it's like, it's one of the shortest epistles in the entirety of the Bible. So if you tell me that you can't read the Bible, just go read Jude. You can read Jude in like 2 minutes. It's not long. But if you look in Jude, Jude tells us he so wanted to write to us about the salvation that had been given to us, but he found it necessary that he had to write to defend the faith, because there were so many people who were just attacking the faith at this point. So that's defense, but then you have one that's refutation, to refute. This one's great. I mean, it's good, but here's the problem. Me as a Christian, I've kind of come to learn this, and I'm sure other people out there, you as Christians, have come to learn this as well. I think this kind of applies to anyone, whether you're Christian or not. To be genuinely honest with you, just because you refute someone and break down their arguments doesn't mean yours are true. It doesn't make yours any more truer just because you say someone else's is wrong. Actually, this goes really well with the vindication of proof, because if you can break down someone's arguments, then genuinely, then yeah, you can provide evidence for why yours is true. But just because you say yours is, just because you say someone else's is false, doesn't make yours true. So those are three different three different methods for doing apologetics. And also, guys, in this video, in the comments, kind of let me know what, if you guys are really into apologetics. Let me know what is your favorite way of doing apologetics. Let me know, do you guys love just giving proof, or do you guys just like going straight to the scriptures and just saying, hey, this is what the scriptures say, deal with it, kind of thing. So let me know what's your favorite. Because I'd really love to hear that. I think it's interesting to hear what you guys have to say as well. Also, I told you that we would get into three different men. Now, listen, I know that there are so many guys. I could do a whole episode on men throughout church history. I could do a whole episode on that. But let's be clear, I don't have, this is just not enough time. Like, I don't want to sit here and talk about different guys from church history all day. I may do an episode on that one time, but I don't know yet. But we're going to talk about three different men here from church history. The first one, he's probably one of the most famous apologists to ever live. Literally, his name is Justin Martyr. Okay, so Justin, like I said, he's known for his two works, actually three works that we're gonna we'll kind of go through as we're talking about Justin here. But Justin, he was born to pagan parents, and basically when he was growing up, he searched his entire life for the meaning of truth and the meaning of life, and all these different kind of things that I think sometimes we naturally think about ourselves. We just don't admit it, but we do. But also, Justin, he seeks out everything he possibly can. Like, I mean everything. So in his dialogue with Typho, if you haven't read that, it's really an interesting read. Kind of gets you into the mind of into the mind of Justin, to really get you to understand what he thinks about Scripture and the covenants and all these different kinds of things. But Justin, he tells us in the dialogue of Typho that he wrote, he tells us that he followed a Stoic. Now, if you don't know what the Stoic is, kind of go do a little research on who they are. But basically, come to find out that he realized that this was just stupid to follow this guy. It was just dumb. Like, I mean, just a waste of his time, basically. The reason that is not because the Stoic wasn't smart, but because the guy didn't believe in God. The guy thought that there was no need for a God, so therefore Justin thought there was no need for him, and Justin left. Now, the next one that Justin kind of followed is, he said he followed an itinerant philosopher or preacher. But the only problem with this guy is that this guy, come to find out, this guy wanted Justin to give him money to follow him. So basically, this guy could possibly have been a scammer. Could have been, the guy kind of could have just been an idiot. I don't know. Justin doesn't really say much more about that, because he tells us that he left after that as well. But not only that, but then Justin, then soon after that, he goes and he follows a Pythagorean. Now, a Pythagorean, when he meets this guy, the very first thing he asks Justin is, do you know music? Do you know geometry? Do you know astronomy? And Justin didn't really care. He just didn't care. He was like, look, I don't have time to deal with this. I just want to know if this is going to provide me with what I need and what I'm seeking after. And this guy, Justin, said, he said that he loved his own wisdom. And there's a lot of people like that today. I don't think the world's really changed much, but he loved his own wisdom. And Justin said, well, I don't love you. And he got out. Ran away from that guy, basically. He was like, I don't have time for this. Then he goes to the last thing he comes into is Platonism. Now, Platonism, even though it's intellectually demanding, Justin said, even though it's intellectually demanding, it just left me empty the whole time. It just left more questions than answers. So then Justin, kind of being frustrated, I think I'd be rightly frustrated as well, as I'm seeking after truth, and I'm trying to figure out, what the meaning of life is and all these kinds of things. And then all of a sudden, I'm just not coming up with anything good. Basically what happens is Justin, as we can tell, and as far as we can tell, there was this field that he knew about, and that most people didn't bother him when he went there. What happened is, when he got there was this old man. Justin had never seen this guy before a day in his life. It's kind of like those people you run into on the street and they know who you are, but you don't know them. I know a lot of people like that, and it kills me, because they're like, "Hey, we know you," and then I'm like, "Hey," "Yeah, good for you." I may went to high school with them. I may have worked with them somewhere at one point in time. It's like, I just don't know who they are. They knew my grandparents. Like, cool, but point is, Justin didn't know this guy. He had no clue who he was. Now, this guy starts an interesting conversation with him. He looks at him, and they have this deep, like hurt your head, hurt your brain, make you feel stupid kind of deep conversation. And they're talking about the existence of God. They're talking about the soul and the immortality of the soul. They're talking about guys like Aristotle, well, not Aristotle, but they're talking about a bunch of philosophers like Plato, for example, and they kind of talk about those guys. And then he tells them that even though those guys are smart, these philosophers are smart, they don't know everything. But he does tell them that there's these things called prophets, and God used the prophets to speak His word accurately to the people. And the only reason they knew the things that they knew is because God was speaking through them. That's the only reason that they knew. And then he goes on to tell them that not only that, but he goes on to tell them that of the Christ. He tells them that Jesus had come, that Jesus had died, and then he kind of tells them that to kind of seek God to reveal these things to him, to make it more clear, to make it more known. And when he had left, he said he never met this guy ever again. But when he left, he said that a flame had kindled in his heart, and that he just fell in love with the prophets. He fell in love with the apostles. He fell in love with Christ. After this, says Justin, we kind of learn that Justin in 132 AD, he goes to Ephesus, and he has this long dialogue with Typho, which is hence the name Dialogue with Typho, which is one of his more famous works besides his two apologies. They have a long debate, I can't remember how long it is. It's super long. I'd have to go back and look. But it's ridiculously long. And Justin basically makes this guy look like a fool. Like, he schools this guy. And Typho is a Jew. But really, they have this just long conversation about the interpretation of Scripture. Really, it boils down to three sections. It boils down to the Old Testament covenant is passing away, being replaced by the New. The Logos in the Old Testament, the Logos in the New Testament is Jesus, and that happens to be Yahweh from the Old Testament. And then also the Gentiles are replacing Israel. They're the new Israel. And they have this long, deep conversation, and Justin just makes him look like a child, basically. But then after that, a little bit later down the line, Justin, he goes and he writes his first apology, and he writes it. And this is how bold. Like, I don't know if I could have done this, because I knew that it probably would have got me killed. I feel kind of bad saying that, but it would have got me killed. But Justin writes to the emperor at the time. He doesn't just write to, just some Romans, He doesn't just write to anybody. He writes directly to the highest person in the Roman Empire, who's the emperor himself. He writes to Ananias Pius, basically telling him, hey, look, we're not your enemy. We're your allies. Stop hating on us because we're Christians. Okay, we can actually help you more than hurt you. And then he even straight up just tells him, hey, look, every religion out there is nothing but a cheap and false imitation of the true religion, which is Christianity. Then sometime later, I think it's in 161 AD. Check me on that. I may be wrong, but 161 AD, he writes his second apology um, to the Roman Senate. Again, some of the highest people in Rome. Like if he gets in trouble, like who can help him, because nobody else is higher than these two, than the emperor and then the Senate. And so basically he writes to the Senate and basically just gives a whole dissertation on why Christianity is just rational and why it should be accepted, and why if you're not in Christ, you're going to be eternally condemned, and how Christ came to save and teach us the truth about who he is. Shortly after this, Justin and his followers, they get arrested, and basically they get beheaded. That's basically what happens. It doesn't end too well for him, or for a lot of people in the history of the church. It just didn't end well. There wasn't happy endings in the church sometimes. But he got his head chopped off. Hence the name Martyr. He got martyred. His last name wasn't Martyr. It was Justin. But then they named him Martyr because he got martyred for his faith in Jesus. Now, the next guy we're going to talk about, he didn't get martyred, but he did get persecuted quite a bit. Now, his name is Athanasius. Athanasius lived in the 4th century, and he's known mostly for when he was a bishop. But Athanasius wasn't always a bishop. He also was a deacon at one point. Yeah, he was a deacon. Athanasius, he really, for the most part, got in trouble for his run-ins with the Arians and their just dumb, very, very dumb beliefs on who Jesus is. Basically, what happened is Arius, he genuinely was going around speaking just dumb stuff. Like Arius, he was a Libyan presbyter, which means he was a bishop or a priest of some kind. And what he did is he went around saying things like, if Jesus was begotten, then Jesus, there was a time when Jesus didn't exist. Basically, what he's saying is that there was a time when Jesus was not. There was a time when the Son was not. Now, in Athanasius' defense against the Arians, he writes a lot about this, like a lot. But basically, we have to understand Arius is wrong. We have Jesus himself in John 17, literally saying, Father, let me be glorified with the glory that I had with you before the foundation of the world. Jesus is literally speaking about a time when he pre-existed before the foundation of the world, with the Father and the Holy Spirit, before they ever made the unique personal choice and decision to create the universe and to bring it from nothing to something. Okay, and then we even have Paul. We have Paul himself telling us in Colossians 1:17 that he's before all things. Jesus was the first and only thing to ever exist. He never came into existence, but he was the first thing before all creation to exist. He just simply exists. If you even look in John 1:1 and John 1:2, it's a direct echo from what Moses wrote in Genesis. Because reason that is because it's about the same person. But what that is saying is that in Genesis, we come to find out that God is eternal, that he's prior to all creation, and that he's a pure being, which means that he just simply exists, that there is no time, there was no point in time which he ever came into existence, but that he simply, in and of his own nature, just exists. He can't help but exist. That's just who he is. It's just in his nature. And since John 1:1 and John 1:2 is literally a echo of that, and it's about Jesus, then Jesus is of pure being as well. He just simply exists and has come and never came into existence, and he exists without a cause. Now, it's kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around, because everything that we experience has a cause. Jesus has no cause. He literally is the self-existent one. He is the great I am. Athanasius, he knew how big of a deal this was. Athanasius was what we would call ticked. He knew that what Arius is saying, he's literally robbing God of his word. But not only that, but he knew that salvation is at stake. Salvation is at stake here. Like, Jesus has to be, he has to be fully and truly man to pay for our sins, but he also has to be truly God to forgive us of our sins. So he's truly man, truly God. He has a dual nature, and it's called the hypostatic union. I don't even know how to really explain the hypostatic union without making my head hurt. Um, but anyway, he knew that Jesus had to be both. He had to be God and man in one being. He had to be God and man at the same time. He had to have a dual nature. Now, when it comes to um, the Council of Nicaea, because when this is all going on, all the bishops at the time around the area were just fighting with each other. Like at one point, someone describes it as gnats fighting in the air. So basically, what happens is Constantine, who everybody thinks was like a Christian, he was not a Christian, but it's my opinion. But he orders, not for theological truth, but for just unity's sake, he goes and he gathers all the bishops. And he invites like 1,300. Yeah. Had to think for a second. 1,300. No, I'm sorry, 1,800. That's right. He invites 1,800 bishops, but only 300 show up, and Athanasius was absolutely there. And during this whole entire thing, they bicker, they argue, they fight. When it comes down to it, Athanasius and Alexander, they condemn Arius, they condemn his teachings, and they exile Arius and his followers out of the church. And then when that happens, then basically they make it illegal for anyone to possess any of his writings. So this is highly serious. And Athanasius was absolutely thrilled. He's like, thank goodness I got rid of this guy. But to come to find out, it's kind of like poison ivy. When you think it's gone, it's not really gone. It's kind of just lingers and grows back again. Well, that's exactly what happened with the Arian heresy. What happened is some of the Arians, they kind of thought, we want Arius to come back to the church. They go to the emperor, and then they kind of convince him that he should be let back into the church along with his followers. And then the emperor goes to Constantine and says, hey, look, let these guys back in. Athanasius says, no, he's a heretic. We need to leave him out. We got him out, leave him out. Don't let him back in. Don't let a wolves with sheep clothing back in. It's kind of stupid. It's going to destroy all your sheep. Your entire flock's going to get eaten alive. But no one listened to Athanasius. And when he refused, those guys who went to the emperor, they basically they falsely charged him with treason, sorcery, and not paying his taxes, and even murder. Yeah, all those they absolutely accused him of, and then he gets exiled from the church, basically. And this happens like 3 times until finally when he finally returns home from one of the last times, he's like 70 years old. But during that time he was in exile, he wrote against pagans and Jews alike, and he even wrote about Saint Anthony of Egypt, who was like a very, very influential monastic desert father. I mean, he even influenced Augustine, who ends up becoming a Christian. But yeah, so he writes letters to different churches, talking about when feasts and festivals should happen, and then he gives the list of the 27 books of the New Testament that he thinks and that he believes should be in the New Testament, and that's the same one that we have today. And then soon after this, Athanasius, he dies. But he dealt with a lot. So that's Athanasius. But so the next guy we have is my favorite theologian of all time. Put in the comment section who's your guys' favorite theologian. Mine, I have like a top 5, but I'd say above all of them, it's Augustine, and that's who we're going to talk about here. It's Augustine of Hippo. Augustine was he was born to a pagan father and to a Christian mother named Monica. They were of Berber origin. Remember, he was born in Africa, Berber origin, but though he may have had a mixture of Italian stock in his background and his family, they were certainly certainly Romanized. Now, here's what happened. We're gonna fast forward a lot, and we're gonna jump to when Augustine's 17 years old. Augustine, like most young men, he had a problem. He liked women a lot. He liked women a lot. He wasn't really focused on his studies or whatever, but he wasn't focused on studying or learning. He was just focused on chasing after girls. But when he was 17, he left. He left his hometown in northern Africa and he goes to Carthage. Now, in Carthage, he gets really wrapped up in his studies. He gets really, really deep into his studies and even reads Cicero. And he even comes to really love and enjoy reading Cicero. And then when that happens, he gets caught up in Manichaeans. Um, Basically, what happens is he spends 9 years in the company of the Manichees. Um, but he becomes increasingly disenchanted with them when he comes to realize that their leader is unable to answer his most pressing questions. So he just becomes really restless in Carthage, and then basically he has reached the summit of everything that Carthage has to offer, and then he leaves and feels the pull to Rome. But then when he gets to Rome, they make fun of him for his accent. And then his students. And this is how I know that the world hasn't changed much since the 5th century when Augustine was alive. Students were too lazy to show up for their classes. Too lazy to show up, and they have no idea who's teaching them. Like the greatest theologian probably ever lived since Paul. Anyway, they're too lazy to show up for his classes, and then before long, not even a year passes, and he leaves. He leaves Rome for Milan, which is the seat of the Roman emperor in the West, in a city of great significance. And he arrived in 384 A.D. Would soon run into the local bishop, who was Ambrose, who is a former prefect of the city who had been chosen by popular acclaim to be its bishop 10 years earlier, even though he was only a layman at the time. Now, Augustine, when he was in Milan, he basically loved hearing Ambrose. Like, he just kept coming back, and Christianity just made sense to him. But then he also had a few barriers in his way. Like, he just couldn't understand how God could be immaterial, and the problem of evil was also in his way. But Platonists solved this for him by helping him understand, evil doesn't have really any existence on its own. It's just the absence, or it's just a defect or the absence or perversion of what is good. It's everything that is made is good in and of itself because it's made by the supreme being. So basically, this gets solved for Augustine. But what happens is Augustine he really just had a lot going on. Like, every little sin that he made, he genuinely just couldn't get over it. So there was one day he was walking in his garden, and he heard a voice saying, he heard a voice saying, "Pick up and read," or "Take up and read." Picks it up and reading. It's Paul's letter, and I think, if I'm right, it's Romans 13, and it speaks about we shouldn't just be walking around in drunkenness and sexual immorality and stuff like that. Basically, changed Augustine's life. He quit being a teacher, which he was a teacher in at this point. He quit being the teacher. He writes a letter to Ambrose talking about his conversion and wanting to get baptized. Now, he gets baptized by Ambrose, but in 391 A.D., he takes a short visit to Hippo, which is a coastal city in northern Africa, and basically he goes to a church service, and the local bishop, who was an old man named Valerius, he spots Augustine, and then he pretty much scraps his entire sermon and looks at the entirety of everyone there, and speaks about how he needed an assistant. Everyone knows that Augustine is the right choice, and they just throw him forth, pretty much wanting him to be ordained, even though Augustine never wanted it. But Augustine basically gave in to their wishes, and he became ordained. But the local bishop in Hippo, he couldn't speak the language very well, so pretty much all of the teaching and preaching was handed over to Augustine, and eventually, 5 years later, the Valerius dies, and everything is handed over to Augustine. But when he became bishop, I'm telling you, it just didn't get any easier for him. It just didn't get easier. He got what he wanted. He wanted to be bishop, but it didn't get any easier. Like, I mean, in 411, I mean, by this time in the 400s AD, they're already dealing with this thing called Dotanism. Basically, Augustine didn't think they were heretics or orthodox wise, the theological wise. They were pretty solid, but they did deal with church discipline in a really messed up, extreme way. So in 411, um, he attends a council held at Carthage, whose main purpose was to reconcile Dogmatists back to the mainline church. In theory, it's successful because for a lot of Dogmatists were reconciled and they were put back and they came back to the fold of the church. But by then, just so much antagonism had gone deep and it just couldn't be eradicated overnight. And even after that, he dealt with Pelagianism. Now, Pelagianism, basically, there was this British monk named Pelagius. He didn't believe in original sin, and he did not believe that man was inherently, because of our forefather, because of Adam, because he was our representative and our federal head. He didn't believe that because of him that we were born into sin. He believed that man was sinful by their own choice and that they can make up their minds, and there was some goodness left in us, and if it was nourished just right, then we could return back to God and do his will. Augustine basically said that's just stupid, first off, and second off, that to warn everyone about this guy. And basically the church, they exiled Pelagius, and by 420 by 426 AD, realizing that his days were numbered. Basically, Augustine, he chose a certain God to be his successor, and they governed the church for a few years together. And during this time, I think this was just really cool to show his heart. Like, just during this time, he goes over his earlier writings, just correcting and noting where he had changed his mind since first writing them. But anyway, moving on a little fast forward through Augustine's life here. Around 429 AD, the Vandals had basically broken in. They already basically just demolished Rome, and they basically were now heading to North Africa, which was one of the last fortified cities. They're one of the last fortified cities, and what this means is that basically when they break in here, everybody's gonna die. There's no either they're gonna die or, well, yeah, they're probably gonna die. I was gonna say they're gonna be made taken back to where they're from, but no, they're probably gonna kill them. Augustine is 76 at this point, and they do break in. They do break into to northern Africa. They do break into Hippo. But when this happens, Augustine doesn't die by the sword. He doesn't get slaughtered. He doesn't get beheaded. He simply just dies of a fever. Even though they raid Hippo, Augustine's work still survived, and it's still one of the most foundational, doctrinally, philosophically, exegetically. All his work is it's literally the best that we have since the writing of the New Testament. So Augustine's just very influential, whether you hate him, whether you love him. Some people really love him, some people really hate him. Either way, these three men, including Augustine here, they were all phenomenal. So that's kind of what some of these guys dealt with throughout their time as apologists, as theologians, as philosophers of the Christian faith. So that's kind of how apologetics has worked with these men throughout church history. In the comment section, let me know who your favorite apologist or theologian or whoever is throughout church history. Just let me know, because I love that stuff. And if you guys like more of this, I'm going to be doing videos like this every few weeks or so. We'll see. This next week I'm going to be kind of busy, like really busy. Like, I'm not going to have time to even do a video. Probably it may be a few weeks from now, but every few weeks or so, usually I'm going to be trying to put these videos up and And if you guys like this video, put in the comments what you guys would like to see. So until next time, until I come back with another video, I'll see you guys then.